over 10 years for LDCs and 5 years to non-LDCs to remove tariffs on 90% of trade. But in actual fact, there's an additional 3 years for LDCs and 5 years for non-LDCs to achieve a 97% liberalisation. So it really is a very significant degree of liberalisation, and that's of course going to be very important in terms of modelling. The other thing I'd just say on this first slide as well is it doesn't only involve trading goods. It also involves trade in services, and investment is very much a core component as well of the AFCFTA agreement, trans-border investment. And so these things increase the complexity of the modelling tasks that we have at hand. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Now, this is a summary which comes from a recent World Bank publication by Coulibaly. And there's a specific chapter, I think chapter 6, which is on this topic of the AFCFTA, and it provides a very useful overview of the different simulation results that have been undertaken on the AFCFTA. And if you check on the first column here, I think the most striking thing initially is the variety of estimates there in terms of GDP results from these CG models that have been undertaken, ranging from the African Development Bank study, which suggests only a 0.10% gain, to the World Bank 2020 study, which is a 4.2% GDP gain. So there's a large range there. You can also see the World Bank, the IMF study as well had a range of results, which was even larger. They tried out scenarios, and they partial equilibrium as well as the general equilibrium, if I recall correctly, in that study. So that's the first point to note, that there's quite a wide variety in GDP results. And the second thing to look at the column of intra-African trade, which is really the objective of the whole AFCFTA initiative. And here you'll see things ranging from the Jensen and Sondry study back in 2015, which is only a 4.3% increase in intra-Africa trade, to the AFDB study in 2019, which is suggesting a 107% increase in trade, and African Development Bank, the World Bank, 92%. So you can appreciate here that it's quite a wide range of results, very much depending on how the modelling is undertaken. Now, these studies are computable general equilibrium models. They're generally based on the GTAB. The underlying database, at least, is the GTAB database. But it all depends on, firstly, whether it's a static approach to the modelling or whether there's dynamic elements introduced. And so that very much complicates the interpretation of the results for the lay reader and also for the policymaker. When you use the dynamic results here, for example, the World Bank, we're talking about scenarios where we're talking about 25 years before the whole agreement is implemented. And so GDP numbers on the size of a larger GDP, it becomes rather complicated to extricate what the real results of the liberalisation under the AFCFTA vis-a-vis the natural growth of the economy over that period of time. That's one thing that even handicaps the original Melville and Karingi study in 2012. You will be aware that figure there of 52.3% increase in intra-African trade is probably the most widely cited number when we talk about the AFCFTA. But in actual fact, if you look into the way that my colleagues modelled those scenarios, in actual fact, it's more like a 30% increase solely due to the AFCFTA, and the other 20% is due to natural growth. So that's one complication I just wanted to point out. If we can move to the next slide, please. Now, let me just make some opening points here very quickly. Firstly, CGs are notoriously bad at providing accurate forecasts. They're not really a forecasting tool, even though they're sometimes interpreted as such. And this has been known for many decades now. There was a lot of controversy over the bad performance of CG modelling with regards to NAFTA. There was a vast underestimate of the trade impacts on the Mexican economy and an overestimate on the amount of impact on the US economy. And I think, wise economists such as Paul Krugman were already flagging the problems that can arise from taking these models too literally. one of the reasons actually that modelling tends to show that there are relatively few benefits from the AFCFTA, and where we see the more modest results in some of the studies in the table before, is partly because of tariff erosion over time. And in actual fact, Jen, if we could just move to the next screen quickly, please. Tariff erosion is basically the secular decline that we've seen in applied tariff rates over the last 3 or 4 decades, really quite dramatic for developed countries, but also for developing countries. And this means that as tariff rates have been lowered, the benefits from tariff liberalization reflected in these models is proportionately smaller as well. So that's one reason. A second reason, actually, if we could move on to the next slide, and then we'll come back to the previous one, is actually a lot of existing trade is already covered under existing free trade agreements. So, for example, within the East Africa community, if you were to run a model on the AFCFTA for the East African community member states, because tariffs have already been removed on the intra-EAC trade, you will get no effective results on those member states. Now, you can appreciate that some countries belong to regional blocs, such as Ethiopia belongs to COMESA, but actually has never actually applied the tariff reductions under the COMESA free trade area. So because of that, actually, you see large results on liberalizing the Ethiopian economy under the AFCFTA, whereas some other economies, where they've already covered the bulk of their trade, for example, the Kenyan case, 64% of the trade is already covered by existing FTAs, which is principally the EAC, but also COMESA. Then we shouldn't large results simply from tariff liberalization. So if we could just go back quickly, please, Jan, to the 2 slides before. Yes, thank you. So that's one structural change that I think we need to be aware of. And actually, I wrote a paper some years ago with Professor Agustin Fossel, where we actually looked at the CG gains generally for the African continent because of tariff erosion, and concluded that actually multilateral liberalization didn't have a lot to offer for the African continent, precisely because of the different context from the 1970s and 80s, for example, when tariff rates were particularly high on industrial goods. So that's one point. A second point I'd really like to stress here is this is precisely the reason why a lot of the models now have shifted towards modeling non-tariff barriers. And that's particularly the case of the World Bank 2020 study, which shows the larger benefits from the AFCFTA. Now, that raises a number of questions. For example, how we model those NTBs. Some models use the iceberg approach to the modeling of reduction of NTBs. Some use tariff equivalents, so they calculate tariff equivalents. I've looked at some of the estimates for tariff equivalents, and they can be extraordinarily high, which suggests like the NTBs are like 200% or 300% in some sectors, which to me sound unrealistically high estimates. And I believe there's been some efforts to fine tune some of them, because although most of these estimates are made through econometric modeling, some of them sometimes don't seem particularly realistic. Another challenge for modeling the AFCFTA is that official trade data is notoriously unreliable. Generally, actually, globally, there's quite a bit of double counting in trade, but particularly on the African continent, where we also have a lot of zero results as well between member states, for example, where there's a lot of tariff lines where there's no trade being carried out. Now, in sectors like that, if you liberalize trade, a model will show you zero impact, simply because there's zeros on both sides. But that doesn't mean that removing the tariff barriers doesn't provide a longer term incentive for investment in those sectors or for new trade to appear. But we can't easily model results where there's existing zeros. That's a problem also for gravity modeling as well, which I'll make a few comments on in a minute as well. Another area of difficulty in modeling the AFCFTA is services trade. Bilateral services data is very patchy and very unreliable. as well. And a lot of economists stress these days, deeper integration is important. You know, we shouldn't only focus on the merchandise trade, and certainly for East Africa, there's a lot of benefits in service trade liberalization, but the data is patchy on that. So some of the studies that I cited in that table are based, you know, include services trade simulations as well. And a final reflection here, Armington elasticities are intrinsic in these models to make them work, to avoid extreme scenarios where all global production of a particular good may end up in one location. They're not something that exists in the real world, they're something to make the model function properly. So that's one problematic element, I believe, in this kind of modeling. And it's also useful sometimes to review the elasticities which are implemented in these models to make them run, because often they're not based on real world data, or if they are, sometimes it's on data studies that were carried out 30, 40 years ago and on other parts of the world. So often standard elasticities are applied per sector without considering regional contextual information. So that can be also a problem. So Jan, if we could just move forward now 2 further slides very quickly. We've seen this one. Next one, please. Right, this is actually, oh yes, I animated this one. If you could keep clicking. This is just one of our own modelling exercises that we carried out with Trademark East Africa. And we actually started off with a static analysis of the AFCFTA removing tariffs. And because our office deals with the wider Eastern Africa region, you can appreciate that most of these results were coming not from the intra-EAC trade, because we were only liberalising tariffs on merchandise good, but actually from the other member states of Eastern Africa. And the trade and with the rest of the continent. So these figures for us were rather disappointingly low, you know, in terms of the benefits. And with regards to the creation of jobs here, that wasn't computed within the model. We did some elasticities of growth to job creation elasticities to see how the liberalization, tariff liberalization would impact on the trade and the GDP figures, and then impute from that how many net jobs would be created. But as I say at the bottom of the page here, these estimates, we believe and argued, were very conservative because it didn't include the non-tariff barrier reductions. It didn't include trade facilitation measures, which are extremely important in the World Bank 2020 study for producing those larger results. And it didn't include services trade, where we believe East Africa has some competitive advantages. We did actually try these simulations out again using a tariff reduction of reduction of NTBs of around 20%, and we got much larger results. The welfare benefits suddenly went from 1.8 billion up to 32 billion. So you can appreciate how sensitive results are to the modelling framework. Next slide, please.
Andrew.
Yeah, I'm just wrapping up actually. Yeah. Is that okay? I've got 2 more slides, I believe.
Yeah, this is okay, Andrew. Just go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So one way of looking at all these things is, you know, I mean, we are enormous advocates of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we want to give to member states, you know, reliable information. But as you can appreciate, results tend to be very sensitive to the modelling framework that you use. Now, one way of arguing about these things is to look at other experience of deeper regional integration and see the trade results. And I think now with the European Union having had its single market program now in place for 30 years or so, 3 decades, we can now do an evaluation on what actually happened looking backwards, which is always a more reliable way of proceeding. And econometric studies such as that carried out by Maya and colleagues using the PPML, which is a much more reliable estimator for these kind of things, found that the single market program of the European Union more than doubled goods trade, 109%, and 59% increase in services. And they found that the impact of the European Union liberalization was 3 times larger than the effect of a standard regional trade area, which is just restricted to merchandise goods. So that's important to look at that kind of evidence for comparable examples. Next slide, please. Final. So I just wanted to say something here also about econometric modeling as well, because, for example, the trade economist standard tool is the gravity model. And gravity models have also gone through a bit of a process of revolution over recent years, particularly with the introduction of PPML estimator, the Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood estimators. And these are much more appropriate tools for estimating the benefits from regional integration because they don't bias the estimator in the same way that it does under just standard like fixed effects or random effects gravity models. Because of the zeros that I mentioned, the zero observations, for example, they're much better able to handle that. And just to give you one example of the kind of inconsistencies that arise, Andrew Rose in 2004 posed a very important question. He said, to what extent has global trade growth been caused by GATT and WTO processes? And as economists, I'm sure you're aware that the majority of people feel that the multilateral liberalization under GATT and WTO was very successful in reducing tariffs and boosting trade. But Rose came to this very surprising finding that actually he couldn't find any evidence of the World Trade Organization or GATT, its predecessor, increasing global trade. And you can imagine amongst economists, there was a were by different economists, and they were told it was unreliable. But now we've had recent papers like Esteve Perez in 2019, which use the more reliable Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood estimator and find that Andrew Rose's original findings were robust. So I think that also causes us pause for thought there about the reliability of the trade modeling, both from the CGE perspective and from the econometric perspective of gravity models. So my final conclusions here would be, we need to be very careful about the way we package our numbers and be very cautious in terms of the way we present the kinds of economic impact because of this wide range of differences according to the modeling techniques. Now, it's a complicated world that we live in because you know, policymakers clearly wish to demand. I see you are having problems hearing me. Can you hear me now? Okay. These are my closing remarks anyway. Yes, I mean, I was saying, you know, there's a demand for numbers, and particularly trade negotiators, they want to know what the approximate impacts are. But I think as economists, we have a responsibility to be as clear as possible about the limitations of our numbers and our frameworks, and portray both conservative results and more optimistic ones, and give them the range of potential results from our modelling. So thank you very much. I'm sorry if you weren't able to hear all of the explanation, but the slides are there hopefully to guide you. Thank you.
Yes, the connection problem is from Nairobi, but technicians tell us that it should be fine now. So could participants online tell us if you can hear us?
Yes, we can hear you, Xenia.
Oh. Back in business.
Back in business, yes.
So, Andrew, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Aha. So there was a moment then, we were switched off. It was when you were talking about the impact of multilateral processes. But maybe if you could, for us here in Nairobi, just wrap up in a few seconds, if possible, the last messages that you shared with the participants who could hear you and they were online.
Yes, so I mean, the general point I was trying to make there was that, even amongst the econometrics techniques that we have, there's been some important changes, and the reliability of all the studies that were carried out using gravity models, because they weren't using the appropriate econometric technique. If you are to carry out a gravity model, you need to use a PPML, and especially on the African continent, where there's, as I said, a lot of zero values in trade, bilateral trade. So this carries over to this study of Andrew Rose, who found that the WTO hadn't been the major cause of trade growth. And I think there is a consensus amongst a lot of economists actually now that regional processes have been one of the main drivers of global trade growth, particularly over recent decades. So that was the main point I was making, that actually when people have reanalyzed Andrew Rose's studies, which were at the time controversial and were challenged by a number of authors with different studies, in actual fact, when more recent analysis has been carried out using PPML estimators, they found that Andrew Rose was right in terms of there was very little evidence that the WTO had been a main driver of global trade growth over the last 6 or 7 decades. So I just wanted to introduce that element to suggest at the end, as modelers, we need to be very careful about how we package results. And clearly policymakers have a big demand for having hard numbers for things, but we need to frame things in a way that they understand that there's probably a range of results depending on the modeling scenario, and there's a degree of reliability in certain types of techniques more than in others. So it's a complicated world there for modelers, really, and how we package this and explain this to policymakers and the general public in terms of results. And we need to make all the necessary caveats, I think, when we're carrying out these exercises. So those were my concluding remarks.
Andrew, thanks a lot for this interesting presentation. Please stay with us and join the panel discussion, which will take place after the 2 presentations that follow. The first one is by Didier Tabarot. He's joining us from Washington, and he's a macro modeler at the Ministry of Finance of Rwanda. Didier, are you with us? Can you hear us? Didier? Aha. The floor is yours. We cannot hear you. We can see you, Didier, but we cannot hear you. Also, participants online cannot hear you. So can we maybe then start with Wilson from Uganda? And in the meantime, maybe this technical obstacle can be solved. But let's maybe start with Uganda. Yeah, Wilson, yeah, the floor is yours.
Team, yeah. Yes, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope those online, you can hear me.
Yes.
Those online? Okay, assuming you can hear me, thank you. Once again, I'm Wilson Asimwe. I'm from Uganda. I'm a senior economic modeler at the Ministry of Finance in Kampala, Uganda. I work on economic modeling and forecasting, and I'm going to take you through how the role of models in policymaking in Uganda, and which models do we have and what do we use them for. I'll look at the economic models we have, and also a new models we're trying to build, which are largely climate related, and also the status where they are, and how we are integrating all these models, and how they are supporting us, and how they have influenced policies, and then I will conclude in a few minutes. In Uganda, the previous speaker talked about econometric models, CGE models, and other models. In Uganda, we have a number of models. I'll mention a few. We have a CGE model, which is a computable general equilibrium model. And this model largely captures the backward and forward linkages of the country, the structure of the economy, so that in case there is a shock in one sector of the economy, it has both direct and indirect effects on other sectors of the economy. So it captures all these effects into the total effect. So that's the CGE model. We run it in a software called GEMPAC, but majority of the modelers in the world, they use GAMS. We also have a macroeconometric model. A macroeconometric model is largely uses econometrics and time series data, and largely estimations. The previous speaker talked about it. And it largely, we use it for forecasting macroeconomic variables like inflation, GDP, exchange rate, and other variables. Then we have the micro simulation model. They do analysis at aggregate level, at a macro meso level. But we have a micro simulation model, which helps us to do analysis at household level. And this captures issues of poverty, inequality, social welfare of households. So we have these three models, but they're interlinked. They are interlinked, which we call they are integrated. And all of them, we call them the integrated macroeconomic model. So we call them one model. So the results from macroeconometric model, we can pick them and input them into the CGE model. When we get the meso effects of the shocks, the macroeconomic shocks. Then we pick results from the CGE model and put them in the micro simulation model, which is in SATA. And that gives us the micro impacts, like effects on inequality, poverty rates, how do they change? For instance, now we are facing issues with pump prices are going up for petroleum pump prices. So there we use the micro simulation model to capture pump prices, increasing prices of everything, all commodities which are being purchased at household level. And this has impact on poverty. So to capture the effects on poverty and inequality, we use the microsimulation model. So each of the model has its advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, the CGE can capture interaction between sectors and answers questions like what if questions. If government allocates money to the elderly people, what's the impact on the economy? Yeah, if let's say we do some, let's say, climate change actions, and we plant the first cover and increase by 10%, what's the effect? Yeah, the CG answers such questions. Then the others are largely for policy making. Then we have other tools which we use, like the employment index tool for employment, petroleum sector model, which is helping us in the area of managing the oil and gas sector, which we are expecting to roll out soon, and also the data sustainability analysis and other more tools. But these are the main tools. Then what I've presented doesn't have climate change. And now it is a lot of push on climate change, because we discover that, yeah, we are affecting the climate in our actions, but the climate is also affecting us in terms of reducing the resources which are used to push up GDP. So we found that the traditional modeling doesn't bring in that when we increase production, there is consumption of natural resources, pollution, and environmental degradation. Those things are not captured. So we are building new models to capture that, and also to bring in issues of the balance sheet of the economy. Yeah. So this has pushed us to climate change modeling. Then over time, Uganda, we have experienced things like drought and also depletion of natural resources, and we are seeing the effects of climate change now. You see the photos which are shown there. The first one, it was landslides. Soil moved up from the mountain and just covered the houses down. So that's effects of climate change. People were doing cultivation, cutting down trees, and the soil became loose and had to move down. Yeah, then the middle one is a famous hotel, which we call Serena Hotel. I think even in Kenya you have Serena Hotel. Yeah, the Lake Victoria just expanded because of maybe the channels we are interfered with, wetlands people are building there, and it was filled with water. Then the bottom one, some households had to move away from their households because of floods. So all that's climate change, and all this is pushing us to making sure that we include climate change modeling in our models. Then we come to the economic models. I've already discussed them. We have the integrated macroeconomic model. On the other upper corner, we have the climate change, and we have government down here, but there was no link to taking intended actions to protect the environment, and also the environment to protect us in the future. Yeah, so the climate change modeling is helping us to bridge that gap. Then which models are you building for climate change? There are 3 models we are building currently. Okay, yes. Okay, yeah, those are the models we have. I'll keep the climate change for the second part. But
you hear us?
Yes, now we can hear you again.
Okay, good. So Wilson, thanks a lot. There will be questions in the panel discussion. So I would like now to see Didier, can you hear us? Can we hear you?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
Great.
Okay.
So the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. So I'll be talking about an overview of the tools we use in the Ministry of Finance in Rwanda, in the Chief Economist Office, in macro modeling and policy advice. Next slide, please. Okay. So on this, I'll state this sentence from George Brooks. So all models are fails, but some are useful. This is just saying that macro modelers, we have needs from our policymakers to find a way to explain different things. So all that means it's difficult to find a model which can explain like accurately the different changes in the economy, but there are some which are useful. And the first presenter said that depending on what you're doing, like let's say for the CGA, a static and or a dynamic one, it's actually the outcome you get could be much different from the outcome in the real economy. So in the Ministry of Finance, we have different tools. Here I'll be presenting what we have. It's the integrated macroeconomic framework, which is the financial type model, the nowcasting model, with GDP, and we have in pipeline kind of soon operationalizing the quarterly macro model, and we have a revenue forecasting tool, Arefoto. We have the Rwanda SAM CGE model and the long-term model. Next slide. The integrated macroeconomic framework, which is the core model in the Ministry of Finance, which actually gives us kind of the main forecast for the all macro indicators. It's a financial programming type model, which is used at 50% owned by the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. And in policy advice, actually, it helps us assess the economy, macroeconomic stability, and draws different policies to it helps also to define the budget envelope and in discussion with the fund. It also helps us attract external financing as to obtain interesting interest rate from government borrowing from credit agency. In that sense, it gives an overview of how the economy is, and it's a tool which helps us project the Rwandan economy at the medium term, let's say 5 years at most. Next slide. After that, we have the nowcasting GDP. So this helps us to cater for the problem of the need to state the economy at now. So so mostly the publication of GDP is as a delay, a lag of a quarter. So on that need to know where the economy is, the nowcasting actually provide that. So the nowcasting tool in Rwanda is a bridge equation-based quarterly, and it uses different leading indicators such as turnovers, export, import, production volume to actually predict now the GDP in the current quarter so that we can provide insight to the policymakers. Next slide, please. And the the quarterly macro model is actually in pipeline, as I was saying, and soon it will be operationalized in the Ministry of Finance. So the main objective of this model is to provide a forecast and simulation of key macroeconomic aggregate in short to medium term, meaning 12 to 20 quarters. And it forecasts GDP, inflation, aggregate demand, fiscal deficit, debt, exchange rate, interest rate. So it's a kind of small DSG kind of model, which helps us to be up to give us a sense of where we are after having a medium-term projection from the integrated macro framework. It gives us where we are and to give advice to the policymakers. And we have also a revenue forecasting tool, which provides a tax projections, which is used again in the integrated macro framework, which I want to mention, which is the co-host model in the Ministry of Finance. So the Refoto gives a period of 3 to 5 years forecast of revenue, and by tax stream, actually by different tax we have in the tax in Rwanda. Next projection, next slide. And then we have the long-term model. The long-term model, which is a dynamic general equilibrium type of model. It's kind of based on the again on the integrated macro framework, which is the base. It's a most financial programming type of model, but it helps us to go through a longer term period, and the one we have goes until 2050, and it helps us to model the contributor to growth to that longer period, which is for labor, education, skill, private capital, and TFP. And it has also a demographic and education and health module, which determine the growth of labor and human capital. Next slide, please. I'm going quickly because of the timing. And we have also in pipeline to be operationalized before the end of this year is a CG model. And in Uganda, Asimwe goes through what they have, and then the first presenter, it's some CG model which we use. As Asimwe said, it's a kind of a model which helps us to respond to what if questions. Same thing for Rwanda. We use this model to actually to kind of give advice to policymaker to what would happen if we raise, let's say, VAT tax, any tax from a rate to another one. So, and for us, it's built on a SAM database which we built, and the latest we have it from 2017. Next slide. Yeah, I think I wanted to go quickly, and if there is any comment and question, please reach out. And I think we'll meet in the second session, which will be a QA. Thank you. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, online we can hear you, but I hope Nairobi too.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, we can't hear Nairobi. No.
we just take this as a break? Maybe we can do a break between.
Online, can you now hear us?
Yes. We can hear you, John.
Okay, thank you. Didier will just give you 2 minutes to conclude. We lost connection, so we missed your concluding remarks.
Oh, so actually, if I don't know where you lost me. So I think I was saying that due to the timing, and I presented, I think the 5 tools we actually use in the Ministry of Finance, and I want to emphasize that all the models we have in the Ministry of Finance are interlinked, because we want actually to have a kind of to feed in the cohorts model, which is the integrated macroeconomic framework, which gives us a medium-term projection for the macroeconomic indicators. So saying that, I'll be, if there is any question from the participants which were online, or if I should go again through my presentation, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Didier. We're going to have a session where we'll collect all the questions online and in the room. Andrew, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, thank you. So Andrew, Didier, and Wilson here in the room, they'll be taking questions, and I'll ask the online participants to raise their hand, and we'll ask them to unmute and ask their questions. The participants in the room will be equally asking questions, and so I just want to open the floor for anyone with a question. Then we'll pick a round of questions and then we'll respond.
So my question would be, as GIZ, what is our work supporting this modeling in the various ministries? Do we do capacity development for advisors being placed in the ministries, or what is our advisory work there? And last question, before the figures or the results of the modelings are used for policymakers to base decisions on it, what is the process? I would like to be a bit more interested in the process there.
Yeah, going a little bit in line of that, it's also quite interesting to understand how reliable the data is that you are actually using, like where does it come from and how is it in the countries that you are using the data from, what are the sources, and yeah, are they like considered mainly reliable?
Okay, thank you very much. I have several questions regarding technical issues in renewable energy and energy efficiency. We have several policies in terms of setting up thresholds for getting authorization in terms of installation, so on and so forth. And then we have some proposals regarding taxes. But through the process, where not only in my country and several countries where GIZ is operating, we work only with the Ministry of Energy. And then the decisions are mainly based on some benchmark in the countries, and then see and make decisions. And sometimes we have problems in implementing them. Will it make sense in terms of stakeholders to involve the Ministry of Finance at this level of formulation of policies regarding renewable energy efficiency, and try to model the impact at the macroeconomy level so that that can inform the decision-making process, because most of the time we set up policies and then when implementing it, it becomes a problem. And is it possible for the existing model to introduce data related to renewable energy efficiency, and even the commitment of countries in terms of CO2 reduction? From my country, I've never seen a study highlighting what is the impact of reducing the CO2 emission on the economic activities. Are we going to gain something, maybe indirectly or directly, in search of data missing? Is it possible to do it? And then will it make sense automatically to involve the Ministry of Economy and Finance if they have so, and then develop the policies together? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
We'll respond to this round of questions and then we'll come. First question, I'll ask my colleague to respond. This relates to how GIZ plays the role in supporting the ministries.
Yes, the macroeconomic and investment policies project in Rwanda has supported the development of models in cooperation with the Ministry of Finance, and has also supported capacity development. This means training on how the models can be used. So there were 3 models that have been developed in cooperation. So Jan also can shed some light about this process. I mean, it's a long-term process. I mean, it takes time to develop these models, because some are more simple, some CG is very complex. But then I would give the floor to Didier. I mean, how do you see the role of the GIZ? How did you see this role in Rwanda, and also maybe address the issue of the reliability of the data?
Yeah, thank you, Senja. So as you said, for Rwanda in the Ministry of Finance and MIP, the Macro Investment Program. So from the starts of the program, we, as I said, even before capacity building by GIZ, the Ministry of Finance had what they call a framework, and then with help of GIZ, they try to help the Ministry of Finance to have a kind of an integrated framework, which means to have a simple way of using the framework and to actually enhance it. And in the timing, GIZ has been there to capacity building, as Senza said, the integrated macro framework, now casting, and even the latest CG and macro modeling. So they help the Ministry of Finance in terms of capacity building, of having someone to build capacity in the Ministry of Finance, and to provide, let's say, a software sometimes to use some models. And that's will take me to the data relevance. In Rwanda, actually, we kind of have the chance to have a very large database. So the national statistics has a very large kind of data, and rely on those data to actually build our model. Let's say for the SAM-CG, it's built on data from national account, balance of payment from the central bank, and some from the Ministry of Finance. From the integrated macro framework, it takes data from the central bank, the National Institute of Statistics, and different departments within the Ministry of Finance. And I would like to also talk a bit on the process, how to advise the policymakers. Let's say in Ministry of Finance, we have this channel which we provide insights through reports. So in the Ministry of Finance, we have an overall big report, which is publicly on the website. It's the annual economic report, but we have, again, a monthly report we provide to the minister directly, which is a monthly economic brief. And we have what we call policy notes. It's different reports to actually on a specific problem. And we could write like a policy note, let's say, on fuel price increase, on any shock, and using the outcome from a model, we can explain and give advice to the management in the ministry. Thank you.
Thank you, Didier. You've spoken about the issue of data sources and data reliability, but you've also spoken about the role GIZ plays in Rwanda. You've also spoken about the process of using this data for policy making. I would like to ask Wilson to briefly speak about the process. How does that work, say in Uganda? How would this data or these numbers or whatever inform policy making?
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for the nice questions. To talk on the process of the data, how does it move from data to policy? Government, we largely use government data. Yeah, we collect data from the field. So we have a body which is mandated to collect data. That is the Uganda Bureau of Statistics. And it collects a wide range of data sets, like household survey data. I think you have heard about that. Data from companies, data on GDP, data on prices, and a lot more. So we use this data to create models which can use this data to mimic the behavior of Ugandans. The behavior in consumption, behavior in investment, and behavior in decision making. Now, once we have that, now we look at the behavior of government. What can government do to reduce poverty? So we have a number of policy options. We try to use these models to test each one of them and see the one which gives us the best policy outcome is the one we recommend for government to take. And when the government takes such an action, we see that poverty reduces or the intended objective for the policy are attained. But without models, you'll find that you just take decisions and do action, but the result may be not the one you intended to get. But these models help us to test what we are thinking. As it's always said that models don't replace intuition, but the models help us to organize our intuitions into a policy which is optimal and which can yield the best from the little resources we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilson. There's one question which relates to energy efficiency. Would it make sense to involve the ministry in the policy formulation on issues to do with energy efficiency and the impact of reducing CO2 emissions? Yeah, Didier, can you take that on?
You were cutting. Can you please repeat?
There's a question on, will it make sense to involve the ministry, the Minister of Finance, for instance, saying the policy formulation process on issues relating to energy efficiency and the impact of reducing CO2 emissions. How can such data be generated?
Yeah, thank you. So, like, I would talk about in the Ministry of Finance. So actually, we, as I said, having the CG modeling kind of ready by now, we're trying actually to see how to expand that and then to incorporate an environment actually module on our models to be able to kind of model the impact of environment on the Rwandan economy. So that would help to see the efficiency of the use of energy, let's say fuel or any other energy on the Rwandan economy. So this actually, for me, it's in terms of how you can incorporate an environment module in your model, which is kind of very it's a concern because you have to have a right model to incorporate the environment model. So in Rwanda, we have to incorporate environment, one of our model to in the future to see how environment and policy can be advised in terms of looking at our CO2 emission and energy efficiency.
Thank you, Didier. And I think the next discussion will also draw some light because you're going to look at the need for climate policy to economic modeling. So we're going to have to dive deeper in the next discussion. Now, if we look at our program, we had 10 minutes of Q&A, and then we had planned a panel discussion. We have consulted each other, and we think instead of sitting down for a panel discussion, let's have a longer session of Q&A, and then we move to the next session. Okay, so we'll take some more questions, and then we'll move to the next session. So I'll take an online question, and then more questions from the room. I want to ask the guys online, please, if you have any questions, I want us to take from the online participants, and then we'll come back to the room. We can do the questions online as they come. There's a question from, how do you pronounce that? Band. I would like to repeat a question. What exactly are the expectations towards GIZ? If you had 3 wishes to GIZ regarding the start and implementation of support for macro models, which 3 wishes would this be? Wilson, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. This is a nice one. The 3 wishes support from the macro models. Yeah, I'll begin with 1. If I was listening, just said what we should I demand from macro models, 1 would look at the issue of climate change. Yes. There are many options or policy recommendations or ideas from research and different scholars on how to tackle the issue of climate change. Models would support in that given the small or little resources available to support this initiative, models would support prioritizing which options to take to make sure that there is an optimal response by governments in issues of climate change. Then the other one, I think my colleagues will add what I would think about models would be to have, let's say, we talk about integrated models, which is a country-based integrated model for Uganda, integrated model for Rwanda, integrated for Kenya. But we discover that we are making individual decisions. But climate change is not an individual issue. Yeah, an action against the environment in one country has spillover effects on the climate of that country and also other countries around. So there'll be need to have an integrated modeling frameworks of countries, so that you take actions or decisions which are consistent with each other. That's the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilson. Actually, what Bernard, what he's asking is, what are the expectations from GIZ? Didier, I'll now come to you. What would be your expectations from GIZ? Didier, you're muted. We can't hear you. You're muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can now hear you.
Okay, so expectations, I would say it's to kind of take what we have now and then go through it, and then if the end line should be actually the ministries or the governments to own all the work done with GIZ or any other capacity building institution through GIZ. So my expectation could be the operationalization of each macro modeling or capacity building through GIZ, ownership and the full ownership by government authorities. So that would be my biggest expectation. So it means a kind of making sure from the GIZ side that the knowledge is passed through the institutions.
Thank you. Thank you, Didier. I don't see any further questions from online. I can see some hands up in the room. So we'll get back to the room and pick some more questions here.
Thank you. So my question is a little bit broader. Maybe Andrew and Didier can answer. So Didier had started by making an interesting statement that all economic models are wrong. So my personal experience working in tax policy at the Ministry of Finance, I tend to see it when we do revenue projections. For example, during COVID, when we gave so many tax exemptions, to manufacturers, to people in the construction business, our projections were so far off on how much revenues we were actually losing. I mean, far off, like not even halfway, you know. So what's up with that? Are we taking into account all variables? Are we just having these personal biases that's clouding the data? Because usually, you know, the data is not perfect, but it's also not that bad. So what's up with that, and how can we better tweak it? So that's my main question. So the second part is that even the most sophisticated model, like the DSGE, the ones, you know, the Federal Reserve uses in America, fail to predict economic recessions, fail to point at bubbles. They fail to say, okay, the 2008 housing crisis is arriving. Even the most sophisticated, even the smartest experts fail to predict that. So what in your view, what's the future of that, and how can we tackle that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ruth, and my question is actually a follow-up on the capacity. It was something that I wanted to ask before. Bernard asked the question. But the experience with Kenya, especially within the ministries, is you build the capacity, and because these are public service commission employees, they could be moved to another ministry. And macroeconomic modeling is a very capacity intense exercise, and it needs a learning process that is continuous. And the challenge with the Kenyan situation is that at some point, the people who had been capacitated, who had been taken through the CGE model, at some point they were not there. So when we were doing the macroeconomic projections for our long-term climate policy planning, we realized that the people that had that capacity had already left. So that is a very interesting phenomenon, because then in terms of sustainability and the handover that we were talking about and the ownership, what is the experience of these two countries, and how can GIZ support this component of capacity building and ownership, that there's sustainability and there's continuous improvement on skills?
Thank you very much. For me, I think I left this realm a while ago. I'm a physicist by basic training, and something science really makes clear is 1 + 1 is 2. When you put assumptions in, then we start talking about abstractness of science. For economics, it's interesting that it defines the social existence of human beings, but built on assumptions. Now, for models, I've been at engagements where, sometimes you just laugh over things. And we once asked the Ministry of Finance team how they came about some figures that were used to project some ratios. And there was practically no answer. And these affect models who then define what happens to everybody. So these are my concerns. There are various types. What is the criteria of standardization for models? Because number one, we have what we call economic types. So if my economy is mixed and yours is capitalist, then we have to be careful about models. So can we start dovetailing models, first of all, towards market types more? Number two, you talked about projections running foul here and there. For me, it will continue to be like that regardless of the model you use, no matter how good it is. Not because the models are imperfect as it were, they're doing the bit, is the source of the data. Let me give you an instance. You source just from government institutions. Have you ever, who has really interacted on the street with the government agency collecting data? My country did census, I wasn't counted. My household was not counted. Some guys sat down somewhere and postulated theory that this area, there are about 50 houses. Nigerians, they give birth to about 3-4 estimates. And that's the problem. So regardless of what the model brings forth, it's far away from reality. I think for GIZ and other supporting organizations, capacity to implement models is like normal training in science. I think the problem is what fits this model. If support can be given in building up the integrity of data, working with the bureaus, working with getting them to the grounds, even you are doing estimates, let your estimates be based on real special dispersions and things like that. That's one. Also, I also have a challenge with Africa. These models were developed in the context of some economic realities of the West that do not exist there. Now, this is a challenge. Already by statistics, the deviation is huge. So you bring the models into Africa, you force feed data that don't really comply with it, because where I'm going is this: how much R&D is ongoing to actually build something, a model for Africa? Africa has peculiarities. We are witness to it. How much R&D is ongoing to do that? Or we're just waiting for MIT, Harvard to roll out something and then we adopt? Thank you.
Sorry, I took some of that.
Thank you for the final round of questions. We'll begin with the last one. And Andrew, I pass this to you just from the last speaker. He spoke about issues around standardization of the models, the quality of the data sources, and how much R&D.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. I heard the first part of the question there. Can you hear me okay? I think we've lost our colleagues in Nairobi again.
But the rest of you, we can hear you.
You can? Okay. Didier, you're just down the street, so I guess you can you can hear me.
yeah.
I just switched to a different Wi-Fi, so it's only in this particular room in the hotel where we have problems. I think all the other areas are fine here in Nairobi.
Do you think we should give our responses, or shall we wait a second?
That's a very good question.
So Xenia just wrote that Nairobi can hear us, so maybe you can start.
I think maybe, yeah, they can hear you, so maybe you can just continue.
Okay, well, look, I'll put my 2 cents in here. I'm not a macro modeler so much as I do as I said, the trade modeling to support the Continental Agreement, but I listened with interest about the discussions and the queries about forecasting, for example, and the reliability of the models. I've always been of the opinion that you don't want to use complex multi-equation models or CGEs for forecasting. That's not what they were really designed for. I think Didier was saying, they're designed for policy questions. So if a minister asks, like if we reduce VAT, which sectors might be most implicated? I think they're good tools for that, but they're not good by any stretch of the imagination for providing forecasts. And that counts for the econometric multi-equation models as well. And I had a colleague some years ago who really suggested a much more simplified way of doing the forecasting, which is much cheaper to undertake, but possibly much more effective. Because I think a lady at the beginning, she said, like, even the Federal Reserve's model didn't predict, the global financial crisis. And I think this has been a repeated criticism of the economics profession. A simpler way to proceed is actually to do what the markets do, okay? The people that, in the financial markets, they have a lot of resources to bring on board the best skilled modelers, but they never use multi-equation models. They simply don't believe in that. They're actually using the information available in time series. And I think that you could save a lot of computational costs and provide much more efficient forecasts by simply looking at high frequency time series data. So a number of countries in our region are already collecting high frequency data on things like electricity consumption, cement production, those real tangible things on a monthly basis From that, you can actually get a much better feel if you do proper time series analysis, very careful time series econometric analysis. You can get a feel for which way the economy is going. And I think that is much more sensitive than trying to recalibrate big macro model. So I think there's some advantage to take a simplified approach if forecasting is what you really want to do. You know, if you're looking at the policy questions of the trade-offs between different sectors, then maybe you invest more time in the big macro models. But otherwise, if you're interested in knowing what the general trends are going to be over the next 6 months or 12 months, and that's what the policymakers are asking you about, then go with the time series data. It's not for nothing that financial markets, the people that try to second guess what's going to happen when they're trading, they use the time series data exclusively. They would never go to a multi-equation model to try to work these things out, just because they have such a poor record of forecasting.
Now the question is if our colleagues in the room are back in the call and can also take up the facilitation again. It looks like we still lost Nairobi, yeah?
Yes, seems like this.
Are there additional questions, comments from the rest of the
question has been forgotten so that it can be taken up.
Online, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yes, Edson, we can hear you.
I'm just for the I'm not an economic modeler, but I'm just wondering now that we are discussing about sustainability, climate change, is the economic models that we have at the moment really adequate? And now that we are questioning if they're even designed for the African context, can we start being innovative about the economic model and what we really mean when we say the economy is growing? Is this something that the economists can start a discussion upon? I think that would be a very innovative, revolutionary contribution for GIZ.
Thank you very much. Was it a question or more like a statement? I wasn't 100% sure.
At least it came from Nairobi.
Some of the consequences spill over and they are not linked anymore. So I don't know. I think we will discuss the climate change part later. So yeah. Sorry. Thank you.
Online, can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes, we hear you. Wonderful. We've been off for about 6 minutes or 7, and we missed what Andrew was concluding with, but we had his earlier submissions. We realized that we have really run out of time. We have another session on climate, the need for climate policy in economic modeling, and that was scheduled to take another about an hour discussion. And so we have about 40 minutes to end our discussion in this room. So I want to beg that we move to the next session, and then we'll conclude at the end of the next session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you everyone here and online for your patience with the technical issues. and I hope that at least it hasn't taken away too much of the quality of the discussions. As my colleague John already introduced, and I think also our previous discussions and the questions build a nice bridge actually for this next part of this today's session, because we thought that we would look at the climate need for factoring climate and planetary boundaries as well. And also we will have input from our GIZ colleagues. So there's going to be Victoria Montenegro, who is an advisor for the Policy Dialogue and Knowledge Management on Low Emission Development Strategies project, which supports climate energy economy modeling activities in Uganda, Nigeria, and Algeria. And then we will have also Sebastian Homm, who is an advisor for the global project on climate resilient economic development, which supports macroeconomic modeling capacities on climate change impacts and adaptation options in selected partner countries. And also our colleague Wilson here in the room, who already started in the earlier session, will also be talking about the case of Uganda. So without further losing time, I hope that our online colleagues are there. I will hand over then to Victoria. Oh, Sebastian is starting. Apologies.
That's fine. So I hope you can hear me well in Nairobi and online.
Yes.
And okay, great. So I'm presenting to you some of our insights in the project Policy Advice for Climate Resilient Economic Development. We are a global project and working in Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Vietnam. And there we are supporting ministries of the economy or Ministry of Planning and Investment in Vietnam in developing developing their economic models to better understand the impacts of climate change. So it's this adaptation part. Can you go to the next slide, please? So yeah, we have these overarching challenges, and the first challenge is the policy challenge. So what was the policy challenge you dealt with, and why did you use economic modeling? So we are working like to bring together two key SDGs. One is climate action. That is, climate change is increasing, but at the same time, we also need to have economic development. So we want to enable partner countries to understand how climate change is affecting them and what they can do about it. What are the different like adaptation options and how effective are they from an economic perspective? So you see here in this complicated graph, different climate scenarios that are like one input into our economic model. And then we have different policy strategies or adaptation options that go into this economic model. And this is also like what Wilson said about the economic models. They should provide policymakers with an understanding how a certain policy intervention, what are the effects, like how much GDP gain can be affected, how many jobs could be like supported with a particular adaptation intervention. And our macroeconomic model is a tool in that regard. So next slide, please. Because I will keep it rather short because I know we are running late. And the next question is how did we engage with our partners and the stakeholders to ensure ownership and sustainable capacity building? Like what also like this question we had, like what can GIZ provide in this case? So first, and we point is like the ownership of the model. Really, for us, it was key that the model ownership is with the partners, like the economic research institutes or the Ministry of Economy in Georgia, that they are the hosts of the model and can independently use it. So we had like as our focus group, the model developers, like those that can, like we also had some experts that can develop the economic models. And for each country, we help those partners to develop one particular economic model that is capable to integrate the climate change impacts. And then what did we do? Like capacity building, unfortunately, a lot of online because of COVID-19 impacts. But here you see in the picture also one example from Vietnam. Like in Vietnam, the participants could gather, but like the input was online. And then we had like particular policy questions, policy actions that were like brought from sectoral experts, like for specific adaptation options that have been already planned in the country. And then we have been supporting the modeling process of these particular policy actions or plans, really to have it like linked to relevant processes. And the last point is that we supported the application of the model for acute pressing policy questions. For example, the impacts, economic impacts of COVID-19 for the national economy, because the economic models are not just there for climate change impacts, but also for other questions. And so using the economic model for ongoing policy questions proved very helpful or to make it relevant for partners, right? So next slide, please. Policy impact. Will the modeling actually impact policy making? Why? How? So this graph is like an illustration how it could work. We actually are in the final stages, and this is a question in the future, like how much will it be used? Like we work to establish the model, how much it will be used. Let's see, right? So in Georgia, for example, there's good interest also from the Ministry of Environment that is in the lead of adaptation planning, and they can use like the macroeconomic modeling, which is hosted by the Ministry of Economy, to have a better understanding of their adaptation measures, to better understand the economic benefits, and then budget can be allocated and the measure can be implemented. So it is in this process that the model can have an impact on the policy making, and it is an economic base for adaptation action. That is the added value that the economic modeling can provide. So I think, what is the impact? I think a key impact is the model can help to better link different ministries and different actors to have like policy formulation based on some evidence or on some like shared understanding of the problem. And with that, I think I'm at the end already. Thank you. If you have any questions. Next slide, maybe you see also a link to our website, or I can also share it in the chat. We have like some publications if you want to learn more about how we approach this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for this and talking about the activities in your project. So Victoria, I think, is next on the program. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll briefly build on some of the elements that Wilson also mentioned and some of the things that Sebastian does in his project are actually in parallel to our project. So maybe you can move to the next slide. One big difference is that we, rather than focusing on adaptation measures, then in the context of climate change, we focus on mitigation. So our partner ministry in Uganda is the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development, and together with them, we try to identify and scope the policy challenge that our modeling should deal with. So it's broadly speaking, the energy transition, and we identified three main scenarios. So electricity access with extended renewable capacities, and their resulting emission reduction is one scenario. The tariff or subsidy reduction and the impacts of this on the broader economy, and improved energy efficiency measures. So what is the effect of these different policy measures on the economy? So what if this question that was mentioned earlier too, what if electricity access is increased by improved capacity, especially in renewable energies? What is the effect on the economy? Maybe we can move to the next slide. So this question of ownership and sustainability of the model, as well as stakeholder engagement, it's something that has been addressed earlier in the discussion. It's, I think, an ongoing process. So first of all, in terms of ownership, the partner ministry, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development in Uganda, is the owner of the model. So the model is currently being built together and built by an international consultant, but it will be handed over to the ministry. And we have very regular bi-weekly meetings with the focal person in the ministry for strategy and coordination, and to identify what needs to be done. We also have different stakeholder workshops with more or less high-level policymakers, and also actors from the different institutions, academia, energy sector, private sector, and different ministries. And based on these first workshops, we have goes to a group of experts, those who are interested in regular capacity building, to take part in regular meetings. So currently we're having a monthly meetings of experts, of which also Wilson Asimwe is part. We're fine-tuning the model, we're fine-tuning the assumptions that are being put into the model, as well as transmitting some of the tools how to use the model. And maybe we can move to the next slide on the open question. If we actually know whether the model will impact policy making. So this is also maybe a question that I can transmit to Wilson Asimwe, as he's representing Ministry of Finance here today. So we do work or aim to work in this direction by involving different departments at the partner ministry, at the Ministry of Energy, by involving different other ministries, Ministry of Finance and Environment, by having roundtables, and by having a model that is, or being as transparent as possible in terms of data collection, having an open source model that will be transmitted to the Ministry of, or to our partner ministry, and on their agreement also to other actors involving academia, and again the term transparency. And as was introduced earlier, we have some experience in modeling in other countries, and recently our Algerian partners, whom we handed over an E3 model, so the model type that we're also building in Uganda. They reached out to us saying 3 years later they would actually now use this model to draft an energy transition law, and could we again cooperate with them on this model and improve capacities to use it within the ministry. So in this sense, we do hope that this is also going to be the case in Uganda, that the model will be used for specific political actions to model scenarios and see the impacts of specific policy measures.
All right. Thank you, Victoria, for highlighting the differences again to the other approaches.
and also going into, again, the question of sustainability that featured highly in previous discussions, and illustrating it on this particular example. So now we will go back to Wilson Asimwe from Uganda, who still has a couple of slides on the environmental factoring in policies.
Thank you. I'll just continue. Once again, those who have just joined, I'm Wilson Asimwe. I'm a senior economic modeler in the Ministry of Finance, Uganda, and I work largely on modeling. I model macroeconomics, microeconomics, also now climate change. Yeah, I'll proceed where I ended about the climate change models we are developing. We are developing 3 types of models, and each one is serving a given purpose. And we envisage to link these models, the output from these models, to the models we have, which are doing economic modeling, so that they can inform policy. The first model we are working on is called the Rapid Economic Assessment Model. And this one is largely addresses quick questions, like if we increase production, let's say of coffee, or increase production of milk, what's the effect on the economy, what's the effect on employment, and what's the impact on environmental variables or climate change variables. Then we also have another one called the E3 Uganda model, which we are developing with the support of GIZ. And this one is largely supporting us in the area of energy. It's well grounded in the energy sector and looking at different energy options. In case we take a certain energy option, how does it help the economy? Then the third one is a big one called the Yuga mode. The Yuga model which we're building with the World Bank. And this one incorporates both the economy-wide effects and also has some kind of time series analysis and also linked to the budget. Now I will show a very quick what each model can do. The rapid environmental economic assessment looks at issues like greenhouse gases, water waste released to the environment, things like full-time equivalent of employment, climate change-related parameters like forest cover, water, and many other things. But it's still under construction. We are working with this. We are developing this with the support from World Bank. Then I will skip this, how it works. Largely, it's like an input-output model. We have the inputs we put into the model, and the output would be, like, say, the output of sectors, and also each unit of output produced by a given sector, it has some waste it pushes into the environment. So we try to capture what is pushed into the environment from each output of each of the sectors. So we bring it together, and we see the effect, and we see how we can mitigate that. Then the second one, the E3, this one we are building it with support or GIZ, and the project is called DIPOL. And in the government, we largely 2 institutions. That's the Ministry of Energy and also Ministry of Finance. And it's still under construction. And once it is finalized, it will help us in a number of issues, addressing questions related to the energy sector, like effects of increased electricity access, reduction of grid losses, energy sources, clean cooking technologies, energy efficiency, electricity tariffs, and a number of them. Then when we look at the Yuga mode, that looks at the investments government is making, let's say construction of roads. Oh, thank you very much. Sorry, I was blocking, I think, our colleagues online. Sorry, yeah. So this one looks largely at the investment part of it and the effects on the economy, and also carbon emissions and other environmental effects from different sectors, and also linking it to the budget. So what we are doing, this model, the Yuga mode, we kind of try to link it with, we work with the Ministry of Water and Environment, and we link it to another tool, which Ministry of Water and Environment has a tool called the risk assessment tool. it identifies risks to the environment. And this Yuga mode helps us to capture the effect. And we also have another tool which captures the extent how our budget is green. Yeah, so I'll talk about that. Then the status, currently what we are doing on climate change, which is done, and we have done it for a few years, is the adjusted macroeconomic indicator report. We did annually. Let's look at GDP. To produce GDP, there is some less natural resources which are consumed, and there's some waste which is released into the environment. So we adjust GDP to take care of those adjustments. And we will do that for a number of variables, and we make recommendations. And we have had success, there is some success in the green budgeting with this report, in that recommendations are being taken into the budget. For instance, the previous one, we had recommended increasing human capital development, and as a result, more allocation was done to education and health sector. Yeah, so we envisage that when these models are complete, we shall be able to do impact assessments, and these will inform the budget in making it more green. Yes, then this is what I was talking about. The whole thing, we have like the disaster risk assessment tool, which is with the Ministry of Water and Environment. It helps us to identify the disasters which are likely to impact on the environment and leading to climate change. Now we use these models to assess the impact, likely impact on the economy. Now, whatever we get from there, we recommend how the budget should look to make sure to mitigate those effects. And then we have a budget targeting tool, which helps us to identify of the total budget, how much has been allocated to green finance or green budgeting. So this is done annually, and we hope as we finish the tool, it'll give us more support in that. Then this I talked about it. The models we have, this is what was missing earlier. We never had the climate change modeling. We are just doing transactions, largely government budget, tax revenue, and how to get more tax, and how to keep the economy stable. But now we are bringing in climate change modeling, which is helping us to link our actions with the climate to make sure that we have sustainable climate within Uganda and also the region. How has this modeling influenced? I've talked about this. The adjusted macroeconomic indicator report has brought some achievements we see in the budget, in green budgeting. And we hope once we finish having all these models up, and we are able to do something like clean energy, and also maybe something may come up financing, let's say, restoration of the environment. Like I showed photos earlier showing that the floods, landslides, and how to avoid that. Maybe planting more trees and something. This would help a lot with the recommendations from the tools. Then we also have policy documents which are supporting us. It's not only models just running around. We have a number of policy documents which are supporting this. But now to come from policy document to action, that's why we need the models to quantify these effects and how to put them into the budget. We have the National Climate Change Policy, which was the year 2015. We have the National Climate Change Act. We have the Uganda Green Growth Development Strategy. We have the Vision 2040 and National Development Plan and the National Environment Act and other documents. And all these provide guidelines on how the environment should be protected. So the models are helping us to bridge from the documents to the action. Then with that, I'll conclude with a few statements. The first one is the models being developed will support government to develop policies that will protect, restore, and increase the resilience of the environment to the attainment of sustainable and inclusive growth. Then the second is there is need of continuous learning from each other across the global economy. As I gave an example earlier, that if Uganda does degrades the environment, the change in climate in the climate of Uganda won't just go by the borders of Uganda. It goes beyond. So we need to learn from each other and make integrated decisions and integrated actions. Then lastly, we all need to take action because the environmental degradation environmental degrading human activity in our country, this is what I've just said, affects also other economies. Then in my slides, I've been putting this kind of picture showing a bee saying, save the bees. I have been putting it up for a reason. One, I put two quotes there in case we don't remember everything, at least we should remember these two quotes. One is, all in all, we need to take action now before tomorrow becomes too late. In regard to climate change, action should be now. And also the last one is, if we save the bees, then we shall save the future of our children. With that, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, and all our presenters. Hopefully it has been wonderful. Some questions have been clarified. Some have been asked earlier in the previous sessions. Yeah, we are not doing so well on time. We have approximately 10 minutes, but nonetheless, we shall have some questions. And maybe before Wilson, you have talked about a lot of models, the Yuga mode, the E3, the rapid environmental model. Maybe our first question should go to those models. Are those models just working in silos? I've seen a lot of synergies that can be built. Why all the three models almost at the same time, running at the same time? Will all the objectives be achieved, or is there a way of consolidating to come up with an aggregated objective?
Thank you. I'll go straight and address that question. One of the presenters said that it's good not to make models so complex and having many complex equations. Yeah, it's better to have a few, more than one models doing different purposes. Like one, the E3 is focusing on the energy and it's doing well. So in case we need anything in regard to the energy, we use the E3 model. Now we look at, let's say, if it's on the economy and we are looking at, let's say, poverty, we use the other models I presented earlier. But when you are looking at things like investment, government is investing in different sectors of the economy and how that impacts on the environment, which means you need a number of equations linking each of the investment of each of the sectors to a number of environmental variables. So it's better to have three models doing different purposes, but they're integrated into one. You can use them at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilson. I think I had questions to Andrew, but let me first open up to the audience, then we shall conclude. Over to you.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Thank you, Sebastian and colleagues, for the presentation. We are also supporting Kenya in the modeling for climate change. And one of the things that I think is coming out clearly is for us to have this mainstreaming from the onset. There needs to be a mainstreaming of what we were looking at, the evaluation of natural assets, the impacts of climate change on different sectors in the macroeconomic modeling. And I really liked what the CRED team, Sebastian's team, have tried to do in Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Vietnam with the integration, trying to see when you're doing the projection, what are the other risks, including climate change? And this helps a government make policies that can direct investments to the sectors that will be heavily impacted from the onset. And for instance, for Kenya, what we did, we used the low emissions analysis platform for the calculation of emissions from the different sectors. We had to rely on the macroeconomic projections from the macroeconomic team in planning, but it's a separate process. After we have an LTS in place, then we start looking at how do we mainstream it in the medium-term plans, the economic plans. So I think there is an opportunity for economic planners to also work with these other modelers in climate to mainstream from the onset, to look at the actual impacts of climate change on the economy, and this will then provide the policy direction for planning. And yes, we could have separate tools or models for different sectors, but I like what you said, that they need to be integrated so that you have a holistic view on the economy. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a food for thought. Thank you so much. Any more questions before we, yeah?
Mine is on, you have talked about models, you have talked about data, you've talked about some of them being implemented. Out of this, I think there have been discussions on some have been working and others have not been working. But I just want to know, out of the representation that we have here from different countries, do we have actually review meetings to say that this is working, this is not working, and how are we going to review and change some of these models which are not working? And where can we be able to see, like, I know you've come up with very good conclusions and recommendations, but is this being implemented, or it's just a matter of just saying it's a conclusion again? In another meeting, maybe in 2 years, it will be another conclusion, but are they actually being realized in refining the models and implementing them?
Thank you. Maybe before the presenters come in, I would give a chance to Andrew. I don't know whether Andrew is still on to respond to that, and then has already left. So I'll give a chance to Wilson maybe.
I'll begin with a question on the models and data review meetings, right? Whether this is working or not working. Yeah, the issue of models is not a tool you build and it's complete. Models are always work in progress, largely because the economy is always changing. Like if we look at 20 years ago, there was no mobile money in East Africa, but now we use our mobile phones to transact. Even some institutions pay using a phone. So there are many sectors keep on coming up and other sectors dying off, and the economy is always transiting or changing. So what we do, we make sure that the models are always under construction. So once the model is complete, we always update, every year we update the data set, and when data comes in and it has changed, the model needs to be changed, the equations to capture the new changes in the economy. So that's like a form of review or what happens to the model. But once a model is not always reviewed, it will always give you something not what you intended. So in modeling, we have a saying that garbage in, garbage out. So we try to make sure that you don't put in garbage. We put some good stuff there. Yeah. Then the other question was largely like a comment, on the natural assets in the macroeconomic modeling, right? Yeah, yeah. That one is very important. It's very, very important because it's good to look at the assets of an economy. Previously, I have not been doing that. But when in our report on adjusted macroeconomic indicators, we also do that. Try to look at the assets, the normal ones we have been looking at. We also look at the natural ones, and also to see how have they been changing. Are they being depleted? Are we growing by depleting the natural asset, the natural resources, or we are growing by keeping them sustainable? So if we find that it's been depleting, we make recommendations on how to restore them. And also we push for financing, recommendation calling for financing to make sure that the trend is reversed. Yeah, so we are doing it, and I also recommend everyone to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilson. Maybe I'll pass over a similar question to Sebastian. As you are building the model with Kazakhstan, Georgia, and Vietnam, alluding to Elizabeth's submission, could you meet up as those nations and see where you're going right, where you're on track, and where things are going wrong so that you can benchmark? Because you realize most cases, GIZ as a project, we're in different countries doing the same thing, but no one can learn from the other. And if anything goes wrong, we all don't understand what's happening. So as for the case of Kazakhstan, Georgia, and the rest, have you tried to be at the same pace and learn from each other? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Of course, this is an interesting part of working in different countries. So one important aspect that we see like on the success of our effort is like how much are partners interested and taking the modeling effort into their own hands. And in Georgia, for example, the Ministry of Economy was in particular engaged as an independent user, and it proved to be very successful because they mobilized all the support needed in getting the data, organizing the sectoral interfaces. So I think this is an important lesson, and also to be like the approach of GIZ is like focusing on capacity building, not just providing the tools, but focusing on this capacity building. And this proved like an important reason for success, right? If the capacity is if there's interest and like ownership, then it is more successful.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. Hope you're done with the submission. And probably, I don't know whether we have any other questions. Do you have any questions online? Anyone in the room with a question?
Thank you very much. Sorry to talk again. I would like to try to have some information regarding the collaboration between the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Finance. The case of Uganda, for example. I'm saying this because I take the particular example, my example. The Ministry of Finance tend to see policy of tax exemption on solar PV or something like they are losing something on the budget. So they even don't want to tackle this issue. Did you try to model it, maybe exemption on tax, and see positive effects on macroeconomic or other sides that could justify and the adoption of such a exemption, for example, if there is such a case, because we are facing that issue, and some exemption, the regulation are not based on modeling on some simulation, but just political decision, and then it becomes hard to implement. Even the Ministry of Finance does not issue deliver the authorization to the border to apply exactly the exemption. And the other question is, I would like to learn from the GIZ project to support the Ministry of Finance in integrating climate change into models, to know what are the steps we took so far, and just maybe we can exchange contacts, but I would like to learn, and that is something interesting for me to inform decision on policymakers in my country in particular. And I know that some French-speaking countries are facing the same issues. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe before we go to Asimwe, Victoria, you're online, and I think it's Dear Paul that is collaborating the E3UG model, where both ministries are involved. Do you have anything to say before we go to Mr. Asimwe?
Thank you so much. I'll be quick. So we're working with, officially our partner is the Ministry of Energy for the model building process. But from the onset, actually, the cooperation or the involvement of other ministries has been approved and encouraged by the Ministry of Energy. And from our perspective, from GIZ perspective, it's been very constructive so far. But maybe Mr. Bulsen Asimwe has more insights on the matter.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. Maybe I'll elaborate more for Mr. Asimwe. How do you manage the political will between the two ministries? How do you manage to collaborate between Ministry of Energy and Ministry of Finance without hinging on the other and working collectively to achieve a common goal?
Thank you very much. I'll just begin by saying that Ministry of Finance works well with all line ministries, not only energy. And always, tax is always a bad thing to citizens. Yeah, but also it's a necessary action for government to exist. So there should be tax always, but we can use tax to move the behavior of society in a given direction. Yeah, but now when we look at this is a good question, and it brings the need for having such models like the E3 model, which is very strong in energy. In the ministry, we have a desk officer for Ministry of Energy. We have a desk officer for every ministry. So everything the Ministry of Energy communicates to the ministry is through that desk officer. And they make their plans and their recommendations. But now when they come to the solar, for some years, there have been a national policy to encourage the use of solar as a source of energy, and taxes were removed. And though we love taxes to raise the revenue, being a poor country, and we have seen a big, wide use of solar in Uganda. Most rural areas where there's no hydro, we have had rural electrification program where we are pushing electricity in rural areas, but those which we have not reached yet, I think most of them have solar now because it's a bit cheap. But we have a very good working environment with the Ministry of Energy. Even with the E3 model which we are developing the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Energy, and working together. So it's a very good environment. And I would recommend other countries also to adopt such. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Wilson. I see our time is past spent, and the last concern was integrating the effect of climate change in policy modeling, learning points. I think we can discuss at length how it is, maybe sharing details, how DIAPOL is doing it in Uganda, because it's not only DIAPOL, but also other projects like the Global Carbon Markets is trying to synthesize carbon emissions and climate change in some other projects working together. So I think we can share at length, and basically even other colleagues, I'm very sure even in Nigeria, DIAPOL is doing something related. So hopefully we can share more and maybe learn from each other, not only between the two of us, but also other members of colleagues within GIZ. I'll beg to put it to the end and probably take it back to Jean. Hopefully there is no any other question online, and over to you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much for your patience, for your questions, for your interest in our session. We're very happy to organize it during the NEDA conference. Sorry for running a bit over time. We have taken, I think, 6-7 minutes more. So I hope we will still make it on time to the session downstairs. We would like to invite you, before we close here completely, to our working group meeting tomorrow morning, where we can maybe tackle some of the questions that we have not managed to answer or to take on during this session, especially maybe what we expect to be the wishes from GIZ. Maybe we can talk a little bit from experience on those. And yeah, maybe for other questions, we would then, of course, need, our partners to elaborate more on that. In this regard, I would like to close with one quote that was in one of the presentations. I think it was Didier's. All models are false, but some are useful. Yeah. In this regard, it's about packaging and explaining the results and making sure that, of course, you don't put garbage into your model so that you don't get garbage out of your model. In this regard, I would like to thank again all presenters very much. One round of applause, please, for the presenters. And then, of course, one round of applause to all the participants, so to yourself. 2 rounds. Okay, thanks a lot. It was a pleasure. See you again. Bye-bye.